Hello, everybody. Hi to everybody that's joining us. Thank you for coming to this webinar on candidate cheating within the tech recruitment process. I'm just going to wait another 30 seconds to give people a chance to log in, and then we'll get started. And actually, while you're waiting, if you do want to scan the code on the screen here to follow us on LinkedIn, that way you can stay up to date with our latest webinars like this one, or blog articles, product updates, and all those good things. Okay, well, let's get started. Hello to Nathan, Loic, and Frank, and hello to everyone in the audience. I am your host today. My name is Natalie, and I'm part of the marketing team here at CoderPad. Thank you again for taking the time to join us as we talk about cheating in tech hiring. So my hope is that you'll leave this webinar with a better understanding of the tools and the methods available to you to prevent, detect, and mitigate candidate cheating. But before we dive in, I wanted to quickly share some practical information. So first things first, I'd like to introduce my colleague Alice, or CoderPad, as you see her here. Hello, Alice. She's working behind the scenes, making sure that everything is running smoothly. And if you do need anything, any help, you can reach out to her in the chat. Secondly, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the recording in the next few days. Finally, there will be time for a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them in the Q&A tab. You can do so at any time throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them all. So after this quick introduction, we will meet our panelists. We'll then get stuck into a roundtable style discussion before moving on to the live Q&A session. Now, that is more than enough from me. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our pros, or the VPs. I'm joined today by Nathan Sutter, Loic Michard, and Frank Hauben. Panel, do you think you could tell us a little bit about yourselves? Maybe let's start with Nathan, then Loic, and then Frank.
Sure. My name is Nathan Sutter. I'm based in Los Angeles, California. I am classically trained as a back-end engineer. Been a CoderPad customer for as long as I've been managing people, and have had pretty much all the hiring challenges you can imagine at organizations of all sizes. So organizations that are really, really small, organizations that are really, really big, and everything in between. So happy to be joining today. Loic, you want to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. Hi, everyone. So I'm Loic, VP Operations at CoderPad. I also have an engineering background. It's been like, I think 20 years now that I started coding. I started like when I was very young, and I take like C, which is like a very low level, very hard to learn language to start with. It was definitely a bad idea. So it's been like close to 15 years. I'm in the tech industry. I created my own company as well. And I'm really into like candidate experience and how to make sure we can provide like the best experience through the whole hiring process. Frank? And I'm in France also, sorry. I'm based in France, Montpellier. Go ahead, Frank, sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Frank. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. I lead the product team at CoderPad, and have done so for the past 4 years. And prior to that, I have background, kind of a variety of different experiences, from finance to the military and so on. But ultimately, I spend the bulk of my time with customers, with prospects, trying to understand and solve problems. And so cheating is certainly something that has come up, both in our asynchronous product as well as in our synchronous product. And so I think with this ongoing conversation, that's kind of what led us to this this webinar today.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here. We're very happy to have you. And now that I'm going to leave that slide for a little bit later, but now that we're all acquainted, let's talk cheating. And I actually wanted to begin this webinar by giving a little bit of context. So I'd like to share sort of CoderPad's position on cheating, call it a disclaimer, if you will. So here at CoderPad, we know that candidate cheating is an issue in tech hiring. Like Frank said, it's something that we're hearing more and more. We don't particularly like it, or at least I don't particularly like it, but we are aware that it's happening more frequently and that it's impacting hiring negatively. That said, we do think that there are many different ways to define cheating within the recruitment process. So we think that it's important that each company formalizes their definition of cheating by listing clear expectations and communicating what's allowed and what's not allowed within their hiring process. So here at CoderPad, for example, we've given this some thought, and as an example, we don't consider that using ChatGPT as a supporting tool during a test or an interview is cheating. However, we do consider that asking a friend to take a pre-employment assessment in your place is cheating. So that's kind of our spectrum. In this webinar, we're going to talk about cheating. We're going to talk about prevention, detection, and mitigation. Because yes, there are ways that you can limit the risk of cheating and the impact that it has on your hiring. So that's what we want to talk about today. We'll get into the technicalities, but we recommend that the North Star remain candidate experience, leading with trust and paying close attention to both quality of content and communication. So now that I've kind of set the scene, I hope, I'd like to talk about some concrete examples. So panelists, do you think you could share some of the different ways that candidates can cheat throughout the hiring process? So what have you seen either from or heard about either from customers or from your peers? Could you share some examples? I don't know who wants to go first.
Sure, I can go first, and then we can just see where we go. So one of the biggest ones is not really super obvious cheating, but it's obvious once you get into digging in with the candidates. So it's especially in initial screens, candidates will or can lean heavily on memorizing solutions. So if a candidate has solutions, in a different window, and they are copying, pasting things into solving things, it's one way you could view cheating necessarily, and it becomes very, very clear that they're not using things that they understand as soon as you dig into a question with them, because they can't answer basic follow-ups. So that's one way. Another way is, which is a lot more overt, is especially in early screening stages, having either help. I've interviewed candidates where it was very clear they had someone off to the left reading instructions and feeding them information. That becomes honestly very obvious very quickly as well, because lag time between asking a question and answering one is too long to be normal for a candidate. Also, I've had a candidate that was definitely on the phone with someone else while they were on the phone with me, so maybe not necessarily in the room, but they have someone feeding them help. So I mean, those are pretty overt and pretty obvious. The first one is, I would say, less obvious and a little bit more borderline, but those are I would say 3 examples that are pretty obvious pretty quickly. Anybody else have any ideas?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, Nathan. And I think like we are talking, of course, like right now a lot about AI, like LLMs, like as a way to cheat. But basically what an AI is, an LLM, is just a friend. You're asking question to.
Phone a friend.
Yeah, so we actually already have this before. It's just that the friend is more available. Maybe we could argue smarter sometime that your old friend, and very easy to find. But technically, that's exactly the same as having someone next to you that is giving you the answer. And so we are also like, depending on like as a company, what you consider being cheating or not. So I guess we will talk about this later. But this could be also like using an LLM if you don't explicitly like enable this, or if you expressly say this is cheating, that could also be a way of cheating, of course. But again, just very close to having a friend next to you.
Yeah, I like how you use that analogy of asking a friend, very available and sometimes smarter, maybe not other times smarter,
Very responsive.
friend. But yeah, this is not a new thing, and it's not honestly limited to tech hiring either. I mean, I think the same worries that we have within tech hiring also apply whether you're hiring a salesperson or what other role that you're hiring out there. But yeah, in a similar way, although these are not new trends, in some ways it pops out in different circumstances. I was chatting with a customer the other day who mentioned that the candidate went to go share their screen and ended up, as we've all done on a remote meeting, ended up sharing their whole screen where they didn't mean to. And on the right-hand side, they had a ChatGPT window, and that you could physically actually see them copy and paste, and then copy and paste and talk through it. And so, yeah, I thought that was a notable thing to understand. And this is in a live conversation to see this person kind of do this back and forth. And so, yeah, I think that was one that definitely stuck in my mind. Is very visual.
Mm. And
We
I
also
think,
have seen
sorry, go
Natalie.
ahead.
Yeah, we also have seen, I remember now, like sometimes candidates develop like very advanced way of cheating, which is sometimes so advanced that we could kind of consider they pass the screen test, because they put like so much energy and skills to cheat like the right way, that it becomes like actually a way to say like they are they are quite good to what they do. So aside cultural fit, of course, but technically speaking, sometimes it's fun to see like how much energy you can put into cheating, which is actually maybe harder than just do the test yourself.
Yeah, and I think it obviously goes back to what I was saying is sort of as an introduction, is that it really depends on what you as a company want to define as cheating, where you want to draw the line. And as well, I think, Nathan, I think you mentioned this. I think like using ChatGPT is one thing, but if the candidate doesn't understand, can't answer follow-up questions, like is struggling to actually grasp whatever they're submitting through thanks to ChatGPT, then obviously that's where you have a problem. And I'm just going to share quickly before we go on to the next question. I've seen a couple of examples in the chat. So David was saying that he had a candidate show up to do the interview that wasn't the person that started on day one. And Alison says that they caught a reflection in the candidate's glasses of a text conversation he was having to get answers to the technical questions. So I don't know if that's a conversation with somebody else or with ChatGPT, but yeah, I think obviously it's a real experience and a real trouble for a lot of you. So yeah, we've talked about some examples. Again, obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it makes cheating a little bit less mysterious, gives you an idea of what is actually going on, what's happening out there. So now that we have things out in the open, I guess the question is, how do you combat cheating? We like to talk about like an anti-cheat toolkit. So basically the idea is that there's not one feature or one method or one thing that will protect you from cheating, but rather a load of different tools and features for you to choose from, depending on your values, your definition of cheating, your priorities, and your company's context. So I'm going to share a list, or actually Alice, I think, will share a list in the chat that we've put together. But I did want to ask the panelists to talk a little more in detail about one or two features that speak to them. So maybe it's what you think is the most efficient or the most technologically interesting. So yeah, I wanted to know which are your favorites, so to say. Maybe Nathan, you could start.
Yeah, I mean, so the one of the biggest challenges with I think early career recruiting and hiring for early career and potentially university students for internships is dealing with a situation that it's very common in a lot of places to hire someone to take in the U.S. we have the ACT and the SAT. So there is a sort of a culture of, and these are context. These are college entrance exams, standardized. If you don't know what those are, so there is a culture of let me hire someone to do this for me. So I don't have to worry about it, or I don't have to sweat it too much, or hire a professional to do this for you. One of the tools that we have in CoderPad Screen is proctoring, which is a piece of technology that asks the candidate to opt in, and it takes pictures every couple of seconds of their webcam. And in the tool, it highlights potential areas of concern. So some of them are appearance changes, someone going off camera, having multiple people in the room on the webcam at one time. So those are just easy ways to use the tool to help you a little bit with some of those what I would say are standard practices for cheating for early career people. For sure, that's definitely one of them. I think another in CoderPad Screen is we're really good. The tool is really good at flagging things that maybe require a little bit of follow-up attention from either the recruiting or sourcing team or the hiring manager, where there is lots of code that's copied and pasted from another window into the IDE, and things like that. So those are two of my favorite, for sure.
Thank you. Loic or Frank?
Yeah, I can go. I will do an analogy. Nathan and Frank know that I love
I know you love
analogy. But I think it's kind of, for me, like the very key point is like in any relationship, like if you don't want people to cheat on you, you don't have to cheat on them. And I think like from like the really beginning, it's really important to first, like as a company, ask the question or define what cheating is, and also define, like, it will sound basics, but like what are the like strong requirements you have in your company to do the work, like how you engineers, like inside your company, are used to work on a daily basis, like which tool they are using, and so then like this ability to really like, so that's like warning message and just ability to personalize the experience at a level where you're like extremely clear with candidate, like you can use that, and that. And for this reason, we really don't want you to do that and that, because this is not what we're trying to learn. And because these tools, for example, are forbidden inside our companies. And so we want to assess you on this one. And it's also like related to high quality content, which is like the more in-depth feedback you can provide to the candidate before they actually start the test, the better the first like conversion rate, like completion rate will be way higher. But also the candidate will understand like why they are taking the test. I have seen like countless feedback from like engineers, peers, colleagues, and friends, where like sometimes they cheat because they don't understand why they need to take that test. And so if you are like very clear and the content makes sense, and you're like, this is the role I'm hiring for, this is the content I built for you to test your skills, and this is what I explicitly authorize or deny during this test, and why, the more chances you have to prevent cheating from happening at all.
Absolutely. And I'm going to give a little bit of a teaser. If you do like analogies and you like cute dogs, then go and read the article, because you'll find all of that. But yes, absolutely. I 100% agree. Frank, was there any that you wanted to go into more detail on?
Yeah, I guess similar to where Loic left off, and you can see it on the screen on the very left-hand side under prevention, the bottom one, custom coding exercises. I think Nathan and Loic know that's one near and dear to my heart. And this may be counterintuitive. And of course, Natalie, to your point, all of these features kind of work together to prevent cheating or detect cheating and so on, and provide the right interview experience. And so you can't go without the leak prevention, the limited copy paste, and so on. But ultimately, it is the custom question to me that actually gets at the underlying need. I guess so. Interview.io which is I guess a platform for candidates to test and to prepare for tech interviews. And so they did a study and found that custom questions are much harder to cheat against. And when you go through and read the article, and we can certainly share that with this group, their study and kind of the findings. But when we refer to custom questions, it's not simply the fact that they're custom, but ultimately that they're more realistic. And more realistic questions are harder to cheat against, especially within our environment where we allow for use cases such as multiple files. It quite honestly is not just realistic and therefore a better experience and better signal, but it's quite literally a harder environment to cheat in because you can't copy and paste across 10 different files when you have multiple files within a working application or working framework. And so it's both more complex to try and ask that realistic question. You'll oftentimes not actually get the right answer out of a LLM and anything like that, and it just won't work out of the box. But even if you had unlimited time, you'd have to quite honestly copy and paste across multiple files, and so it just doesn't work as well. And so that's one thing that I love, because it's killing multiple birds with one stone. It solves multiple problems all at once in terms of addressing the cheating, but also provides just a much better interviewing experience.
Absolutely. I think I was trying to think what I would highlight. I actually think it would be quality content, again, like I said, content and communication. But I think, Loic, you covered that pretty well. So I will mention leak prevention, detection, management. I think it's something that is a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, because obviously for any assessment tool like CoderPad Screen, to have content leak is obviously something we really don't want. The content is the very value of our product. But I'd say that if you are looking at a tool like CoderPad, you need to be reassured that they take content leaks very seriously, and that there is a process in place to prevent any leaks, to detect them if they do happen, and to react quickly. And I think that is something that we try to do at CoderPad, to make sure that content leaks as little as possible, and then if it does, to make sure that that content is refreshed or reviewed, and that we have a process for removal. So yeah, I thought I'd highlight that as well. Do you think you could all, so before we go to questions from the audience, do you think you could share some more personal advice? I think I ask because I know that most recruiters and hiring managers want to prevent cheating, but they also want to feel good about their hiring process. And like we've mentioned, candidate experience, and obviously some of these features, I'm just going to say it, some of them are rather don't necessarily come across very well to developers, depending on their context, depending on how they feel about them. So I guess what I'd like to do is to give advice on how you can prevent cheating as best possible, but do it in a way that's as right as possible by your candidates. So some do's and don'ts, I guess, for cheating prevention. Nathan, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think I'll just continue on with a theme I started talking about, earlier. The biggest thing is, being prepared to do an interview where you dig in as much as possible with the candidate. So having your hiring team, or you, if you're the hiring manager, and involved in the interviewing process, being completely engaged and ready to dig in with the candidate. I think one, it's a great candidate experience if you're engaged and really doing a little bit of pair programming with a candidate. I think that will, one, obviously it's good for the candidate experience, and two, it will allow you to get a lot of signal from whether a candidate can solve a problem And by extension, if they've memorized something or they're, using something outside to cheat a little bit. I think one other thing, and this sort of touches on a couple of questions in the chat, that you want to be as inclusive to your audience as possible. And I would say, some engineers, I mean, we're all a little bit introverted at the very least. Some engineers, are a little bit shy, and they may not necessarily want to be on camera for the first interview. And I would say, I wouldn't take that necessarily as a red flag or something that would necessarily imply that they're cheating. Just because engineers can be a little bit more introverted. So as long as you're being as engaged as you possibly can be with the candidate, and they can walk you through a solution in real time, I think that's a very, very good signal. I wouldn't necessarily personally reject somebody offhand for not being willing to come on camera, or only calling in instead of Zooming in, or Google Meeting in, or whatever your video technology of choice is. So I would say that is something that I would suggest. One other don't would be, and maybe this will get into a don't in a minute. I wouldn't ask questions that really test memorization. And so for a couple of reasons. One is memorization isn't really a skill that is super valuable, right? And part of that is because there's so much information on the internet. You really want to hire engineers who can problem solve really, really well. And while domain expertise is important and things like this, and knowing things off the top of your head are important, giving a candidate a question that tests memorization really, really heavily is not going to give you the signal you want. The signal you want is, can they solve a problem in our domain space that maps to their the potential role that they'll be filling for us. And also that's, by doing something like that, it helps you with cheating prevention, right? So instead of asking like a, leak code type question, or a cracking the coding, opening up cracking the coding interview and pulling a question straight from there, ask them a question that is, tests their problem solving skills, but is as pertinent to your business area as possible. That checks the cheating box, right? Because it somebody who's cheating is not going to be able to delve into the that problem deeply, and it really tests for what you want, which is the answer. The answer you're trying to get out of an interview is, can this person fill this role in my organization? So those are a couple of do's and don'ts.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that also links back to what Loic was said about making it obvious to a candidate what you're trying to test for, why they're taking this test, making it worth their while, I guess, and relevant. Because there's nothing more than a test that's completely irrelevant. Loic, were there any do's and don'ts that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I have let's say a big do, which is like very related to what I shared earlier, which is kind of a homework, like a challenge for you all, is like try to like focus on one. It will sound very tactical, but I will explain later why I think it really matters. Is focus on like the email you're sending to your candidates before an interview. So there could be a screen interview, live interview, like whatever. And in this email, making sure this email answer 4 questions. These questions are what the test will be about, like what will be the content of the test, why, and why this matters for the role. What will you be able to use, like as tools to do the test, and why, and also why this matter for the role. And why does this matter? I think like first is of course like transparency, making sure like you share. This is also like kind of sharing company culture as much as you can with your candidate. This will generate, like, trust me, way more like trust from the candidate and engagement, and ultimately just completion rate. And also this will force you internally to ask you this question, and basically making sure you review your email, you review the content of your test, and you make sure maybe like if you're non-technical, having the conversation with like the technical person in the team that this person will work in to make sure, like, does this actually test what you want to test and why? And that could be like really detailed, like why basically are we asking MCQs to test a very specific knowledge or skill versus doing a language agnostic game that is like very generic. And you have to answer this why. If you can answer this 4 question, I guarantee you, like, you will see your cheating rate drop because they really understand what they need to do that and why they are assessed this way. And ultimately, also, they are very clear about like which tool they can use to do that. And some could be considered cheating or no.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think as TA as well, you're just setting everybody up for success. I think you're putting candidates in a much better position to take that test. You're being transparent. You're putting them at ease, like at least they know what's what and they know why they're taking the test, gives them, they're more likely to actually go through with it. For your hiring managers, obviously making sure that you're absolutely aligned on the role. And so you're going to be getting better hires for them, better candidates going through the process. And you as TA ultimately just got more chance of success in hiring for that role. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily something that's very, very technical, but it's something that's very, very important in terms of communication and transparency and yeah, aligning on skills that need to be assessed. Absolutely. Frank, was there anything you wanted to add, either in the do's or the don'ts, or both?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to kind of tie some of these things together, there's a definite tension between getting more of a, I guess, between a good candidate experience which will, bring in the best, highest quality candidates, and in some way just making it very painful for candidates to go through an interview process. And certainly, there are some of our customers who choose to be on one end of the spectrum or another. But as you, I guess, make it more complicated, make it so that people have to have 6 cameras that are watching them, and have a live person in the room who's proctoring them, just code and so on, you will inherently lose some of your best candidates. And so I think in many ways, just being mindful of that. And so I think what we try and walk the line with our products and with our customers and our advice is, how do you provide that right environment, which is a little bit of what Loick is talking about, the right expectations and so on, because it is establishing that trust both ways with the candidate, and making sure that you're providing the right again, the environment for the candidates to be able to succeed. And I think companies that approach it in that way of not having this adversarial construct of how do I catch somebody and so on, but more how do I enable somebody to succeed. I think if we think about it back to university days, it's, little things that we've tried to do in our product. How do we allow somebody to be able to ask questions within the product or get syntax help within the product, so they actually don't have to go outside? Back in our university days, these were tests where you would be able to bring in notes. And in doing so, you provide the right environment, which is more realistic, and you can succeed because you're not relying on memorization. But also, you are, in doing so, now when they do leave the environment, it is a little bit clearer what they are trying to do. And so I think taking advantage of the tools at hand and providing this realistic experience.
Absolutely. I think I'd add, I guess, making it as realistic as possible, making an interview assessment environment that is as realistic as possible, is also having realistic expectations. So I think the idea is not to expect candidates to perform better than they would on the job, but to have sort of realistic expectations linked to the role that you're trying to hire for. And I think it's a little bit of a pitfall when we do start to see candidates cheating in the hiring process. We sort of try to make the questions more and more difficult, or make it more and more difficult to cheat, and try to catch candidates out, like you were saying. And I think avoid doing that. I'd say that's a don't. The idea is not to make questions more difficult. It's just to, like we said, sort of try and make things as realistic as possible, provide all the tools that the candidate would have on the job, and sort of have that collaborative experience that's as relevant as possible. Thank you very much for sharing all of that. I do want to get to the questions that we've been receiving from the audience. I'm going to have a look here. So I have a question from Jason on interactive tech interviews. So the question is there a consensus that interactive technical interviews where candidates can ask for guidance to see if their assumptions in terms of the given problem are correct are bad practice and can make cheating easier? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I would want to say no. I don't think that's a bad practice to have a collaborative interview.
No, yeah, I would say in fact the opposite. It's a little bit of what Nathan was talking about earlier, and whether this is with just to overlay it on our products within our asynchronous product where you're sending out a test where a candidate completes it by themselves. We have a feature called follow-up questions, and so this is again a way of making sure you're testing the knowledge in more depth. And I think this is what we tend to do in a live interview. Nathan was talking about being able to actually have that conversation and get to the underlying thinking and get their reasoning. I think that inherently there, it becomes very clear quite quickly whether somebody has done everything from memorize an answer to, maybe gotten an answer from Googling or an LLM, asked an LLM for an answer, where, you cannot actually respond at the pace, but also you're able to actually reapply their thinking both to the scenario and to the potential business problems. And that's, I guess, where things get a lot more interesting. And honestly, that's what we hire technical talent because they have this underlying technical skill set. But where it's actually useful, we as humans come in, and where you can't just replace us with, the AI, are the more interesting in-depth questions about, okay, well, that is the answer. How would this scale? And how do you think about this? Now you have a load of this. How would you handle that? That's where I guess you'd be able to press into it and actually reveal a lot more depth of the candidate and get a lot further signal.
I would even say that the consensus is that interactive technical interviews are best practice. And why is that? It's because interactive technical interviews give you as close to possible a experience with a candidate that is like working with them on the job, right? And that's exactly what you want. You want your interview process should be as close to I would guess emulating the candidate being on site with your technical team to solve problems with them. That's the signal that you're looking for. And I would even say cheating is much easier in non-interactive technical interviews than it is in interactive ones, because your ability to, on a take home or a screen, your ability to pull information without follow-ups is a lot easier, right? Like, so you could, if you're very clever, potentially get around some of that without someone actually digging in and pair programming with you live. So I would say very directly, interactive technical interviews are 100% best practice, and I would never recommend for anyone to make a hire just based off of I would say technical interviews that were non-interactive, for example. It should be a part of the hiring process, but that does not mean that you should use this as your only signal. Absolutely not.
I think the only thing I would add, and I don't know if Jason, this is what you were maybe worrying about. I think there is a sort of a balance to find between having interactive, collaborative interviews where you encourage the candidate to ask questions and you encourage that discussion, and then also being able to have sort of some standardization, some structure within your interviews, and sort of so that you avoid introducing too much bias, and avoid candidates having very different information or very different sort of starting points. So I think what I would do is obviously try to give an exercise or a problem or a question that's as clear as possible, and then to take note of any questions that you do have from candidates. So if candidates ask you if they're unsure about a question, by all means answer their, like, sort of set their minds at ease, give them the information that they need, but then take that into account in following interviews. Maybe adjust that question accordingly, just to make sure that everybody does have the same information. So yeah, I think that is a little bit tricky to find that balance. But yeah, absolutely, collaboration, interaction is the way to go. I'm going to go to another question. So we have a question about the screening stage. What about cheating during the screening stage? What tips can you provide to non-technical recruiters interviewing technical candidates that could help with cheating? So I'm guessing this is like in a very early on interview with a non-technical recruiter. How can they sort of identify or prevent cheating at that stage?
I would say, and Loick and Frank, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I will monopolize all of the time talking. I would say, it depends on the stage, right? So we've seen customers, and I've worked with recruiting partners in a multitude of businesses where they will conduct the early screen, right? And they will get on the phone with a candidate to make sure that they are a living, breathing human being. Make sure that they can interact with other people. Maybe that's less of a technical thing, more of a can you talk with somebody? Can you interact with somebody? Sounds very basic, but it's very important. I would say it's really difficult, and we've had some customers we've been working with that are going through some of these challenges now. It's very difficult for somebody who's not technical or doesn't have a technical background to really make an assessment as to whether somebody is just reading off buzzwords and jargon versus having actual technical knowledge. So that's very difficult, and you're going to have to find a very unique recruiting partner for you to do that. So it's difficult, right? I think getting a little bit closer down to we have customers who their entire non-technical recruiting team runs screening for them, right? So there's not a lot of partnership between early screen stages for technical candidates and hiring managers, for example. And the advice I would give everybody here is the same advice I'd give any of these customers is, lean on the tool sets that, if you're using CoderPad or something, another tool for interviewing, right? I think the product does a really great job of flagging areas of potential concern, right? So large portions of copy and paste, very little time spent actually solving a problem. Those are things that I would say any non-technical person can grok relatively well. So I would say lean on the tool sets that you have that not necessarily to determine whether you want to screen somebody out, but use it as a method to follow up with your technical hiring team. So we can speak to CoderPad. The product does a really, really good job at highlighting areas of potential concern there for both technical staff and non-technical staff.
Thank you. I think that partnership is really, really important. I know I can't remember which webinar it was, but we had this discussion with Gerardo and Vanessa from TELUS International, and they were talking about sort of the feedback on what's good feedback, what are good indicators, bad indicators, what to look out for. I think hiring managers can help a lot in sort of sort of making a list of what to look out for and what to provide feedback on. I'm going to go to another question. So a question from Jacek. I hope I'm saying your name right. If a candidate refuses to turn on the camera, should it be a no-go from the start? How do you approach that professionally? And I'd actually tie that to another question from Niraj, who asks, how do you ask a candidate if they're comfortable joining video? So how would you approach that? I know Nathan, you've already mentioned this, but maybe Loick or Frank, you have an answer here.
Yeah, I'd say over the course of the interview process, and presumably, I guess I'm going to cut out there and say you probably have more than one interview before you hire somebody. It is this mechanism of building trust, I think, and it goes both directions, right? It may be fine, and quite honestly, having worked with engineers and for many, many years, and it may be fine on that first couple interviews to just get by without asking somebody. And I think As you get to the latter stages of an interview, though, now you've met multiple times, you've hopefully built up a sense of trust. I think that would be the appropriate time to kind of broach this topic of, hey, I just want to, make sure. And you could pose it in terms of certainly as we look at like going through this HR experience, like there are certain quantitative like legal requirements. I need to make sure you are who you say you are and so on. And I think that's the appropriate time. It's probably not from the get-go on the first conversation of saying, hey, I haven't met you before. Hey, why don't you have your camera turned on? I think, and again, in building up this trust, it can be further down the funnel. There should come to a point where, you have to actually get to some of these tougher things and it's also where you're probably appropriately talking about everything from salary to location and things like that. And I think that would be the appropriate time to be able to actually, I guess make sure that you can accomplish that.
I think the only thing I'd add is that if you have met with the candidate a couple of times and they've not been willing to turn on their camera, I think when it gets sort of late to a later stage and you're thinking, right, I really need to see their face now, I'd tell them in advance before the interview and say, I'm not sure exactly how I would word it on the spot, but basically we will need you to turn your camera on the next meeting. I think you could even be transparent and be like, unfortunately, there have been cases of like identity confusion. I don't know how you could word it, but yeah, basically being transparent about, we just need to make sure that you are who you are, like you say, Frank. But I would definitely give them sort of an advance warning.
Yeah, and to clarify, given the Jonathan, the last, there isn't a legal requirement to turn the candidate on specifically. But for example, here in the United States, we have what's called an I-9 requirement, and it's basically to make sure that, legally speaking, you're able to work for this company, you have legal work permits and so on. And so I think that's the appropriate time to say, hey, I just need to make sure you are who you say you are, you're located where you say you're located. And that's the type of thing that you might be able to use
and I mean, possibly if it's a policy within your company as well, that like in meetings, for example, if you're remote or hybrid, do you ask people to have their camera on in meetings? Possibly say, actually, this is a policy of ours and we want to make sure that you're comfortable with it and that this is a realistic environment, blah, blah, blah. Possibly that's something you could lean on. But that's an interesting question. I would give it some thought about before sending an email. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. So a question from Siva. They ask for review in Google syntax and methods available for few data structures, how to handle such situations. That isn't completely clear to me. I don't know if that's clear to anybody in the panel.
I mean, I could go in a couple of different directions with this, but
maybe Siva, if you could
yeah,
maybe clarify in the chat, that would be really useful. Just so that we don't go off and give you a irrelevant answer. So there's a question about interviews versus take-home challenges. Would you prefer having a take-home challenge or a pair programming developer interview? And I guess this is in terms of which is easier to cheat and like what sort of indicators can that give you? Loic, do you have some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I do. I don't know if Nathan and Frank will agree, but I'm curious. Because it's like, actually, I think this one is really, my perspective on it is like the format, like the take-home versus live interview versus short screen test does not really matter. I think the content itself matters way more. And so if I am being like really idealistic on purpose, like the ideal interview from the candidate's perspective, and thus like cheating perspective as well, is something that like I have a great experience on. I'm learning something about the company. I'm learning something about some skills, like technical details, like whatever. Like I'm go out of the interview, I'm like, I really enjoy this moment. I learned something. And even if I'm not hired, I will go find my 10 other engineers friends and tell them this interview process just worth doing the process by itself. And so it's like take home for me, again, like very personal. I really dislike like very long take home when you have to invest a lot of hours to solve a problem that does not really matter. So I would rather go for like short take homes that are solving some of the company's challenges, and at the same time you're learning. Let's say you're Stripe, you're doing a take home about like you're using your Stripe API, and so you're learning Stripe, you're learning some Stripe challenges on the way or whatever. So it's like interesting and challenging for you. And it's the same for pair programming. So I would have the tendency to say like the final, like where really you can assess both soft skills and hard skills are this like pair programming like live interview, which is like extremely valuable. And so I would do that, whatever I do before, I will still do this one. And I guess depending on some company challenges or which skill you are trying to assess, it could worth doing a take home. But again, like you also have, there is this big project take home, but there is also this very short screen test that could also, depending on the seniority, could be interesting. And so again, like another analogy, like if you're trying to hire a basketball player, if you're trying to find someone like very, very junior, you want to see if they know how to dribble, like basically. And so you can know that by doing a match, like a game. You will know that by doing a very small screen test that will assess this very specific test. But if you're sending the same test to a professional basketball player, you'd be like, I know how to dribble, just go see me during a game. And that's like the analogy for the live interview, which is like, that's a real game, and you can be more realistic and closer to the real technology you're using inside your company.
You really do love analogies.
Yeah.
I did want to share just so you were saying about take-home projects, and they do get some bad rep because they can be time-consuming, like you say. You spend hours on them, or irrelevant, or possibly easier to cheat. But we did actually ask developers so every year we have a state of tech hiring report, and so we survey developers. And we asked them about sort of their preferences in terms of assessment methods and formats. And take homes was actually got an average score of 375 out of 5, which made it their top choice. So obviously technical tests with practical coding questions and live coding interviews, so everything that we've discussed, they were next, and they got great scores. But maybe don't rule out take-home development projects. I think it very much depends on how you make those projects. But yeah, it is something that obviously some developers still enjoy. But like Loic says, I think they need to be able to get something out of it, to learn more about the company, more about your development processes and projects and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think where take homes gets a bad reputation is where you send something that is unbounded. You're not using a product, an interview product, quite honestly, that has things, basic things like a timer. Of course,
right.
If you're somebody who's pressed for time, if you're busy because you're actually, working a job, or you're a parent and so on, and it'll come through, and people don't want to be judged based on their effort, where candidate A might spend 40 hours, candidate B just doesn't have time and spends 2 hours. And of course, candidate A will end up looking better. And so I think going back to what Nathan mentioned earlier on using the tools at hand, and also combined with what Loic said, nobody wants to solve a random 2 hours of algorithmic data structures. And so you want to solve something that is where you might be learning something, not necessarily from a technical perspective, but learning something about the business. If you're interviewing at a travel company, you're excited about travel. And so you hope it is a very realistic problem that'll get you excited and put you in the mood. And then similarly, I think, to kind of the theme underlying this conversation, then I think using some of that take-home project work in the live interview and to ask more questions. And so then it feels, certainly like a seamless experience, but it also shows through of like, there is a point to this. It's not, you sent it in to a suggestion box where you put in that little note and nobody ever looks at it. It's actually useful through the interview, and you learn a little bit about the company.
Absolutely. I think I'm trying to pick one last question. I actually really like this question. It's a little bit, because it's a little bit different to what we've discussed throughout the webinar. So ending on a different note. There's a question about candidates lying on their resumes. So obviously this is a form of cheating, something that we've not discussed. But the question is, I've had a candidate lie about his past experience on his resume. Do we still think that reference checks are a good idea? And I actually personally have an opinion on this. I think, and then I'll see if anybody from the panel wants to quickly give their opinion. I think reference checks can still be valid. I actually hear more and more about reverse reference checks, which I think is really interesting. It's not something that we've actually put into practice yet, but I think it has a lot of potential. It's basically the idea that instead of calling up a reference and asking about the candidate, you call up a reference and you present yourself, the company, and yourself and your role, the role that you're hiring for, and basically say, we have this candidate, we're looking at hiring them for this role with these responsibilities in this context, blah, blah, blah. Basically, you're kind of selling yourself. And do you think that they would be a good fit? And I think it's kind of the reverse of, you're not going to get any irrelevant feedback. You're going to get very specific feedback to your context, your situation. And it kind of puts you in the hot seat as well, rather than the candidate, in as much as you have to kind of sell your opportunity. So I think that's a really, really interesting practice. So I'm happy to be able to talk about it with that question. Did anyone want to add anything? We're in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, Hadley, with that type of reference. These are, first of all, I think reference checks are always good, and it's you always want to pose them as exactly what you just said. You know, present the opportunity in your organization and pose it as, do you, given your experience with this person, do you think they would be a good fit? And tell me a little bit more about, you know, your experience with them that would give me some comfort about whether they would be a good fit in the organization. I think reference checks are always good like that, for sure.
Okay, thank you. It's so frustrating. We haven't been able to get to all of the questions. I will try to either get back to you asynchronously, possibly include your questions in a future blog article. But thank you very much to everybody who's sent questions in. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today. And thank you, panelists, also for being here. It was a really great discussion and I really enjoyed it. I'm going to say bye to everybody, and hopefully I'll see you in a future webinar. Bye, everybody.
Bye.